Hey there, welcome to Quiet History. Tonight, we're travelling back to medieval Europe to explore how ordinary peasants survived plague, famine, and the demands of powerful lords. In a world shaped by hunger, hard labour, disease, and fear, daily life was far more brutal than most people realise. So get comfortable, and let's slowly uncover what it truly took to survive.
A chill, thin as the last breath of winter, seeped through the wattle and daub wall and found the farmer where he lay. He awoke not to sound, but to an absence. The deep, solid silence that hangs in the hour before the world stirs. He lay still for a moment, feeling the familiar ache in his joints. A ledger of decades spent bowed to the soil. Beside him, his wife slept on, a soft, regular rhythm in the dark. He rose, his movements practiced and quiet, and pulled on his coarse tunic and hose. The packed earth floor was cold under his bare feet. He pushed open the cottage door, its leather hinges groaning softly. The world outside was a study in monochrome. A low mist clung to the hollows of the land, and the sky was a vast dark bowl pricked with fading stars. The village of Oakhaven, a cluster of thatched roofs and crooked chimney plumes, slept on. His breath pumed before him as he stood on his threshold, looking east beyond the sleeping huts to where the fields lay. This was the hinge of the year, the moment when the long, dormant exhale of winter met the first, tentative inhale of spring. He walked past the sty where the family pig rooted in its sleep, past the small kitchen garden where the first brave spears of green onion were breaking the soil. His destination was the byre, a low structure that smelled of hay, dung, and animal warmth. Inside, the great ox shifted its weight, a mountain of patient muscle. The farmer spoke low, nonsense words of comfort as he fitted the wooden yoke across the broad, sturdy shoulders. The beast's breath was warm and moist in the cool air. Together, they emerged from the byre, the ox's hooves making soft thuds on the damp ground. To the east, a pale, lemon-colored light began to bleed into the darkness above the tree line. It was enough to see the land. Oakhaven's fields lay in a great open sweep around the village, divided into three vast sections. This was the three-field system, the ancient, unthinking rhythm that governed their lives. One field lay under a stubble of last year's harvest, a pale, golden brown. Another was a vibrant green carpet of winter wheat, stubbornly surviving the frosts. The third, the fallow field, was an expanse of dark, unturned earth, and the tough, wiry growth of a year's rest. It was to this dark field that the farmer led his ox. He fetched the heavy wooden plough from its shelter, its iron share cold to the touch. With a heave, he set it at the field's edge. He took the ox guide rope in one hand and the plough handles in the other, his knuckles whitening. With a click of his tongue and a gentle pull, the ox leaned into its harness. The share bit into the soil. There was a sound then, a deep, tearing sigh as the earth gave way. The furrow slice peeled back, a rich black ribbon smelling of damp clay and decayed roots, of worms and ancient stone. It was the first cut of the year. He walked, his body settling into the timeless, rolling gait required to guide the plough. A slow, deliberate procession across the land. The ox moved with a ponderous, irresistible grace, a creature of pure purpose. As he turned at the headland to begin another pass, the world began to wake. Birdsong erupted from the hedgerows, a chatter of sparrows, the clear fluting call of a blackbird. The mist began to lift, revealing the gentle roll of the landscape, the dark fringe of the forest to the north, the distant smudge of the manor house on its low hill. Other figures emerged from cottages, leading their own beasts to the field's edge. There were no shouted greetings, only nods, the silent acknowledgement of shared labor. Soon, a line of farmers and oxen were at work, each turning their strips within the great fallow field, a slow, synchronized dance of renewal. The sun cleared the trees, a weak, watery gold that held little warmth but poured light over the scene. It glinted on the wet, turned earth, on the polished wood of the ploughs, on the steam rising from the oxen's backs. The farmer felt the chill begin to leave his bones, replaced by the building warmth of exertion. The rhythm of the work was a meditation, the crunch of his feet on the soil, the steady pull of the ox, the endless, unspooling ribbon of dark earth. This was the foundation of everything. The ploughed field was a promise, a blank page waiting for the seed. The wheel of the year, which had ground to a near halt in the frozen months, creaked, groaned, and began with immense and patient effort to turn once more. His world was this strip, this ox, this day of labor. The past was the stubble field, the future the green shoots of wheat, but the present was this smell of broken earth, this ache in the shoulders, this slow, hopeful march behind the plough, turning the dark soil to the light. Long before the first ox was yoked in Oakhaven, a different fire was stoked to life. In the small, stone-built forge at the village crossroads, the blacksmith stood before his anvil in the pre-dawn gloom, his silhouette edged by the dull red glow of the banked hearth. He was a man of soot and sinew, his arms roped with muscle earned from a lifetime of persuasion, of convincing stubborn iron to bend to human will. He pumped the great leather bellows with a steady rhythmic motion, and with each sighing exhalation, the coal bed erupted into a furious constellation of orange and yellow. The darkness of the shed fled to the corners, defeated by the forge's fierce heart. Heat was the first truth of this place, a physical presence that pressed against the skin and dried the throat. It radiated from the fire, from the anvil, from the very stones of the floor, stored from yesterday's labors. The second truth was sound. The smith's world was a symphony of industry. The whoosh of the bellows, the hiss of cooling metal in the water trough, and above all, the hiss of cooling metal in the water trough, and above all, the hiss of cooling metal in the water trough, and above all, the hiss of cooling metal in the water trough, and above all, the sisteroos of the ring of hammer on anvil, a clear, sharp note that cut through the morning air and announced to the waking village that its essential craftsman was already at work. On this day, as on most, the work was not of creation but of restoration. A pile of worn and broken items lay by the anvil block. A ploughshare with a cracked point, a hinge pin worn to a sliver, a collection of horseshoes thin as parchment at the heel. The smith selected the ploughshare, its iron cold and dead. He thrust it deep into the heart of the fire, where the coals burned a searing white. He watched, his eyes narrowed against the glare, as the metal passed through the spectrum of heat. First a dull red, then a bright cherry, finally a vibrant liquid orange. When the color was right, he withdrew it with long tongs, a dripping molten star plucked from a miniature sun. He laid it upon the anvil's horn. the scorched iron meeting the hardened steel. With a sizzle, then his hammer fell. It was not a blind, brutal strike, but a precise musical blow. The hammer was an extension of his intent, each strike folding the heated metal back upon itself, mending the crack, drawing out a weakened point into a new sharp edge. Sparks erupted in a brilliant cascade, dying on his leather apron and the soot-stained floor. He worked with a furious, focused speed for the irons. Willingness was fleeting. After a dozen ringing blows, he judged the moment and plunged the share into the waiting barrel of water. A violent cloud of steam erupted with a triumphant hiss, locking the new shape in a temper of hardened strength. As the morning sun finally cleared the rooftops, the peasant farmer appeared in the wide doorway, the broken handle of a hoe in his hand. He did not speak, merely nodded, his face etched with the morning's labor from the field. The smith nodded back, wiping his brow with a thick forearm. No coins changed hands here. Such things were rare and for distant markets. The farmer would return later with a sack of barley from his own store, or perhaps a promise of a day's help with repairing the forge's own leaky roof. This was the simple, vital calculus of their world. Skill traded for sustenance, service for service. The smith took the broken tool, examining the fracture. He set the iron collar that had held the wood into the fire. His work was the unglamorous spine of Oakhaven's existence. His nails held their homes together. His hinges swung their doors. His shoes protected the hooves of the oxen and horses that powered their agriculture. His plowshares and sickles were the very teeth with which the village bit into the earth. Without him, the wheel of the year would not merely slow, it would shatter. He was a cornerstone, buried in noise and soot and blistering heat, upon whose steady, reliable labor the quiet industry of the entire village silently depended. The farmer lingered for a moment, absorbing the forge's atmosphere, the shocking heat, the acrid tang of coal and scorched metal, the deafening ring, so alien to the open, quiet patience of the fields. Then he turned back to the light, leaving the smith to his elemental realm. The bellows sighed again. The fire roared. The hammer fell, its clear, commanding ring, a second heartbeat for Oakhaven, pounding out the rhythm of endurance, of repair, of making whole what was broken, one red-hot piece of iron at a time. Outside, the village carried on with its quiet mourning, its peace underwritten by the relentless, fiery industry at its heart. The steward arrived with the mid-morning sun, a hard, angular interruption to Oakhaven's soft-focused spring rhythms. He came on a sturdy bay horse, its coat glossy from careful keeping, followed by two bored-looking men-at-arms who leaned on their spears as if the very air of their village was tiresome. The steward himself was a man of ledgers and lines. Thin and precise, was a man of ledgers and lines. Thin and precise, was a man of ledgers and lines. Thin and precise, was a man of ledgers and lines, thin and precise, dressed in a dark tunic of good wool, unadorned but for the heavy iron ring of keys at his belt, keys to granaries, to storehouses, to the coffers of a distant lord who owned the very soil under their feet. His face was closed, a parchment scroll, waiting to be unfurled, and his eyes missed nothing, calculating the number of chickens in a yard, assessing the repair of a fence, estimating the yield of the greening winter wheat field. His presence was a cold stone dropped into the pond of the village. Word passed not by shout, but by a subtle contagion of paused labour. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent mid-strike. Women at the communal well straightened, hands on hips. From the fallow field, the peasant farmer saw the others stop their oxen. He wiped his earth-caked hands on his hose, a familiar, leaden weight settling in his gut, the wheel of the year turned by many forces, sun, rain, seed, and sweat. But one immutable gear in that great machine was the Lord's due. He unhitched his ox, leaving the plough standing in its unfinished furrow, and joined the slow, silent trickle of men moving toward the village green before the church. They gathered there, a rough semicircle of weathered faces and stooped shoulders, their work clothes smelling of soil, animals, and wood smoke. The steward dismounted with a practiced motion, ignoring the villages as one might ignore familiar trees. One of his men produced a small folding table and a stool. Another brought a locked wooden chest. The steward sat, placed a large wax-coated wooden tablet and a sharp stylus on the table, and unlocked the chest. From it he drew a sheaf of tallies-notched sticks of hazelwood, split lengthwise. These were the memory of the manor, the physical record of every bushel owed, every day of labour promised. The sight of them was more commanding than any shouted order. He cleared his throat. A dry, official sound. He did not raise his voice. The quiet of the crowd was absolute, brittle. He began to read from his tablet, his tone flat and devoid of inflection, as if reciting the laws of gravity. The demands were ancient, carved into the fabric of their lives as deeply as field boundaries. For each hide of land, for each cottage, the obligations were listed. First, the labour. 3 days each week from every able-bodied man, from now until the harvest, to be spent on the Lord's own demesne lands, not on the common fields they shared, but on the wide, fertile strips reserved solely for the Lord's profit. The work would be the same, ploughing, sowing, weeding, fencing, but the fruit of that sweat would fill the Lord's barns, not their own. Next, the rent in kind. A portion of every seed sown this spring was due, not from the harvest to come, but from the precious stored seed corn itself. The very future pulled from their own meagre stores. A measure of barley, a measure of oats from each household. A hen from every dozen at Michaelmas, the best pig from the autumn slaughter. The list unspooled. A litany of subtraction. The steward's stylus scratched against the wax, noting adjustments, recording the death of old Wart, whose labour days would now fall to his son, marking the new cottage of the young carpenter. The villagers listened with a silence that was not passive, but dense and complex. But dense and complex. There was resignation in it, the acceptance of a yoke as familiar as their own bones. There was no room for rebellion in that silence. The cost was unthinkable, the hierarchy as fixed as the seasons, but intertwined with the resignation was a sharp, pragmatic assessment. They measured the demands against the remembered harshness of last winter, against the current promise of the weather, against the hidden reserves in their own thatched roofs. The steward's words were a cloud whose shadow they must calculate. Would this year's due leave a thin margin, or would it scrape the barrel clean? Their faces, edged by wind and worry, gave nothing away. The peasant farmer stood with his arms crossed, feeling the chill of the shadow from the church tower. He watched the steward match the new notches on the fresh tallies to the old ones, the two halves fitting together to form a complete account. One half would go back to the manor. The farmer would keep the other. It was a contract of wood, a debt edged in splinters. He thought of his own strips, half plowed. He thought of the seed grain in his locked chest at home, already dwindling. The Lord's due was a claim on time and hope, a tax on tomorrow itself. The steward finished, closed his tablet, and returned the tallies to the chest. The lock clicked, a sound of finality, without another word. Without another word, he mounted his horse. The men-at-arms shouldered their spears as they rode slowly out of the green, back toward the distant manor on its hill. The spell broke. The villagers dispersed, not speaking much, returning to their interrupted labors. The blacksmith's hammer rang out again, but the sound seemed different now. Not just the heartbeat of industry, but the ticking of a clock, counting down the days of the week until their own work must cease, and the Lord's work must begin. The earth waited, but first the due must be paid. The work on the Lord's demesne was a mirror of the work on his own strip, but a mirror that reflected only the labor and none of the reward. 3 days each week, from the chill damp of dawn until the last grey light bled from the sky, the peasant farmer belonged not to his own land or his own family, but to the steward's tally. He joined a sombre procession of men from Oakhaven and the neighbouring hamlets, all moving with the same heavy-footed resignation toward the wide, unfenced expanses of the Lord's field. These lands lay separate from the village's common 3-field system, a contiguous block of rich soil that rolled up to the wooded skirts of the manor house's hill. They were better drained, more carefully manured, and utterly alien. On this day, the task was fencing. Winter storms and roaming deer had broken the woven hazel hurdles in a long section bordering the woodland. The farmer's hands, already calloused and cracked from his own ploughing, worked alongside those of the miller's son and the old shepherd. They cut fresh, straight poles from a coppist's stand, trimmed them with their billhooks, and wove them into new panels with a practiced, wordless efficiency. The work itself was not harder than any other. The physical rhythm of split wood and driven stake was almost comforting in its familiarity. But the context poisoned it. Every swing of the mallet that secured a post for the Lord's hedge felt like a swing not taken on his own boundary. Every woven hurdle that would protect the Lord's young barley was a measure of time stolen from the weeding of his own strips. The contrast with the communal work on Oakhaven's common fields was profound. There, labour was a shared investment, a collective murmur of hope. Neighbours called across the furrows, children ran with water skins, and the midday meal was a sprawl of shared bread and gossip. The work was hard, but it was theirs. On the demesne, a different silence prevailed, broken only by the necessary grunts of effort and the occasional curt instruction from the Lord's reeve, who watched them from horseback like a hawk on a fence post. Here, the work was an extraction. The camaraderie was replaced by a shared, sullen understanding. They were a body of men united only by a common obligation, a tax paid in sweat and sinew. In the afternoon, the work shifted. A great midden heap steamed at the edge of the home farm, a mountain of straw, dung, and rotted straw from the Lord's stables and byres. Their task was to load the precious reeking muck onto wooden sledges and cart it out to be spread on the fallow field of the domain. The farmer drove the ox cart, the beast moving with its customary patience. The smell was thick and ammoniac, clinging to hair and wool and skin. He forked the heavy, warm loads, the steam rising around him in the cool air. This, too, was a bitter parody. He thought of the careful, scant handfuls of manure he hoarded for his own strip, eked out from his single cow and pig. Here he moved mountains of it, enriching soil that would never grow a grain for his children. The wealth of the Lord was visible in this vast, fertile decay, a wealth built from the compounded dues of 100 villages like Oakhaven. As the sun began its decline, washing the sky in tones of bruised purple and cold orange, the reeve gave a sharp whistle. The men stopped where they stood, leaning on their forks or wiping their brows. No words of thanks or dismissal were offered. The tally for the day was simply complete. They gathered their own tools, the bill hooks and leather gloves, and turned as one, a ragged line of wary silhouettes against a darkening land. The walk back to Oakhaven was quiet, each man retreating into the private sanctuary of his own exhaustion. The farmer's muscles sang a dull, aching song of repetitive labor. The smell of the midden still filled his nostrils, a perfume of servitude. He reached his own cottage as the first stars pricked through the deep blue veil. Light spilled from the open door, a golden rectangle that spoke of warmth and belonging. The scent of wood smoke and a simmering pot of peas porridge washed over him, slowly displacing the day's stench. His wife nodded to him from the hearth, her face softened by the firelight. His children, already fed, played quietly on the packed earth floor. He stood on the threshold for a long moment, letting the sight sink into him. A balm for the spirit. This small, smoky, crowded space was his own. The strip of land behind it was his own, to tend and to hope upon. The Lord's dew had claimed his daylight, his strength, 3 days of every 7. But it did not own this moment, this quiet return, this fragile sovereignty of the hearth. He stepped inside, closing the door on the vast, demanding darkness of the domain, and wearily began to wash the Lord's land from his hands. In the damp, green margins where the village of Oakhaven frayed into woodland and ditch, the woman known as Agnes moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She was old, though not as old as the village's whispers made her. Her age was measured not in years but in the depth of her knowing, a quality that set her apart as surely as the moss-grown stones of her cottage, as the first true warmth of spring coaxed life from the cold ground. She was abroad, a woven basket on her arm, her eyes missing nothing. This was her harvest, the gathering of the early green medicines. And her timing was as precise as the blacksmith's hammer strike. She wore thick gloves of rough linen to protect her hands as she harvested the first tender nettles. With a quick, practiced twist of the wrist, she took the top shoots, where the stinging hairs were less fierce and the vitality of the plant was most concentrated. The nettles would go into soups, a bitter green tonic to cleanse winter's sluggishness from the blood. Nearby, the cheerful yellow faces of dandelions dotted the grass. She dug carefully with a narrow trowel, freeing the long, pale taproots prized for their bitterness, which she knew could stir a sluggish liver as surely as a spoon stirred broth. Further on, in a sheltered spot against the south-facing wall, she found the first feathery shoots of yarrow, just a hand's breadth high. She pinched them off, the clean, pungent scent clinging to her fingers, a scent that spoke of staunched blood and calmed fevers. A scent that spoke of staunched blood and calmed fevers. Her basket began to fill with this humble, vital bounty, each plant a word in a language few could still read. Her cottage stood apart, nestled under the arm of a great oak at the village's edge. It was smaller than the farmers' homes. Its roof, a deep, settled brown of old thatch, its garden a tangle of useful plants, rather than orderly rows of cabbages. To push open its low wooden door was to enter another element. The air inside was thick, warm, and profoundly fragrant, a complex tapestry of scents that layered and shifted. The dry, sweet dust of last summer's meadowsweet and chamomile flowers hung from the rafters in bunches. The sharp, clean aroma of peppermint warred with the earthy, fungal smell of dried mushrooms on a string. Bundles of sage and rosemary lent a spicy, resinous note. Beneath it all was the constant, smoky perfume of the herbs drying over the banked hearth fire, and the faint, metallic tang of the clay pots and stone mortars that lined her shelves. She had just returned, her basket on the table, when the summons came. A young girl, her face pale with worry, appeared at the open door, breathless. Her little brother, Edric, was burning up with a fever, coughing, and could not keep down his broth. Agnes listened, her face still, then nodded. She selected a few items from her fresh gathering and from her stores, tucking them into a smaller cloth, and followed the girl without haste. The child lay on a rough pallet in a cottage much like all the others, but fear had changed the air within. His mother hovered, her hands twisting in her apron. The boy's skin was flushed and dry, his eyes too bright. Agnes knelt beside him, her movements calm and certain. She placed a cool hand on his forehead, then his chest, her touch assessing the heat and the rattle within. There was no mystery to her. Fever was a fire that must be banked, an imbalance to be corrected. From her cloth, she took a handful of the fresh yarrow shoots and a dried, crinkled leaf of elderflower. Crushing them roughly in a small mortar with a few drops of water from the family's pitcher, she made a moist, fragrant poultice. This she wrapped in a scrap of clean linen and placed gently on the boy's chest, over the heat of his lungs. The mother watched, her faith a palpable thing in the room, mingling with her fear. Next, Agnes took a clay cup and crumbled into it a pinch of dried chamomile flowers and a sliver of willow bark, which she had harvested last autumn. She poured hot water from the pot over the hearth onto the mixture, and the steam that rose carried a gentle floral scent that seemed to soften the very edges of the room's anxiety. She let it steep, her patience a lesson in itself. While she waited, she murmured, not prayers, exactly, but words of intention, old phrases passed from her grandmother to her mother, to her mother, to her mother, to her. They spoke of cooling streams and gentle winds, of sleep and healing. The line between medicine, faith and superstition was not just blurred in this room, it was non-existent. The poultice drew heat, the infusion would promote sweat and sleep, and a ritual of care. The calm authority of the healer's hands, the power of the ancient words, soothed the terrified spirits of the family. This was the totality of healing, a trinity of herb, hand, and hope. When the infusion had cooled enough, she helped the mother lift the boy's head and trickle the warm, bitter liquid between his lips. He grimaced but swallowed. Agnes rearranged the poultice, her fingers gentle. She instructed the mother to keep him warm, to offer sips of water with a little honey if he would take it, and to send for her if the fever climbed higher. Her manner was neither promise nor prophecy. It was the quiet assurance of one who has seen this pattern many times before, who knows the body's capacity to heal when given the right nudge. She left the cottage As the evening drew in, the mother's gratitude a soft murmur at her back, walking home through the twilight, her own cottage a dark shape under the oak. She carried with her the satisfaction of a craft applied. Her knowledge was a living library, written not on parchment, but in the scent of crushed leaves, the taste of bark, the memory of which plant grew, in which shadow. It was knowledge that stood between Oakhaven and the raw teeth of suffering, a fragile green barrier against the darkness of pain and the terror of the unknown. In her fragrant, crowded hut, surrounded by the dried ghosts of 100 summers, she was the keeper of small, practical magics, the wise woman whose art was the gentle, stubborn bending of nature's wildness toward the cause of mercy. High on a wind-scoured hill, a mile beyond the last strip field of Oakhaven, stood the monastery of St. Ansel. Its stone walls, grey and solemn, seemed to grow from the very bedrock, an outcrop of quietude in a noisy, striving world. Within those walls, in a long, narrow room on the second floor, a single window of thick, greenish glass looked west, framing the village and its lands like a living manuscript. Here, in the scriptorium Brother Cuthbert sat, the world outside held at bay by the profound, focused silence of his task. The only sounds were the soft sigh of his own breath, the occasional rustle of a vellum page, and the persistent, rhythmic scratching of his quill. Before him lay the open book he was copying, a herbal treatise from a distant abbey, its Latin text precise, and its illustrations of plants vibrant with faded greens and ochres. His own sheet of parchment stretched and scraped to a creamy smoothness awaited his hand. He dipped his goose quill into the small pot of iron-gall ink. A black soot it seemed to drink the light. His hand, steady from years of discipline, began to move. The quill's nib whispered across the surface, a dry insect-like sound, leaving behind a trail of glossy dark letters. Salvia officinalis, for cleansing wounds, for calming humours. This was his worship, the preservation of knowledge, one painstaking word at a time. The quiet was not empty but full, a sacred space humming with concentration. His eyes, tired from the close work, lifted periodically to the window. The view was his calendar and his chronicle. Today, the sky was a high, washed blue, scudded with fast-moving clouds that threw racing shadows over the quilt of fields below. He could see the fallow field of Oakhaven, a great dark scarp on the land, and within it, the tiny, slow-moving figures of men and oxen. He noted the progress. Last week, only a few strips had been turned. Now, nearly half the field lay in neat, dark furrows. The work was on schedule, a good sign. The winter wheat field was a brighter green sward to the south, and he could just make out the specks of villagers moving through it, likely weeding. He observed it all with a detached, benevolent eye, as one might watch the orderly workings of an ant colony. He observed it all with a detached, benevolent eye. Their struggles were immediate, visceral, rooted in mud and hunger. His were of the spirit and the intellect, rooted in parchment and faith, yet both, in their way, were acts of cultivation. He returned to his work, completing a detailed sketch of a sage leaf, its veins carefully hatched, but the world outside insisted on entry. A commotion, faint but distinct, carried on the still air, raised voices from the direction of the common pasture near the stream. He looked again. A cluster of men stood in a tense knot, gestures, sharp and angry. Even from this distance, Brother Cuthbert knew the signs. It was a boundary dispute. likely over the placement of a marker stone between the strips of two farmers, washed out by winter rains, or secretly moved under cover of darkness. Such conflicts were the chronic irritant of village life, a spark that could smoulder for generations. He watched for a few minutes until the figures, apparently without coming to blows, dispersed, their body language stiff with unresolved grievance. With a small sigh, Brother Cuthbert set aside his herbal. From a shelf below his desk, he retrieved a different, plainer ledger, the House Chronicle. He opened it to the current page, dated the entry in his neat hand, and recorded the observation. On this day, the feast of Saint Hester. On this day, the feast of Saint Stop. Benedict, the weather clear and brisk, the spring ploughing in Oakhaven proceeds apace. A contention arose betwixt the households of Godwin and Leofric over the boundary at the lower meadow stream. The matter remains unsettled. His notation was bare, factual, devoid of judgment. This too was his duty, to be the memory of this place, to note the mundane pulse of the world beyond the walls, the weather that blessed or cursed, the labour that fed, the petty strife, the punctuated existence. In centuries to come, some other brother might read this and understand the texture of this spring, the human constants that persisted beneath the turning of kings and kingdoms. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dancing motes of parchment dust in the air. The scratching of his quill resumed, now in the service of history rather than botany. He wrote of the Lord Steward's visit the previous week, an event he had witnessed from this same vantage point. He recorded the arrival of a travelling friar who had shared news of the wider world, a distant war, a bishop's decree, before moving on. His chronicle was a tapestry of the local and cosmic, the village dispute sitting alongside the friar's tidings. This was the monastery's role, a sanctuary of learning and reflection, a lighthouse whose steady beam of prayer and parchment looked out upon the rustic, struggling sea of ordinary life. The peasants fought over inches of soil. The monk recorded it, measured it against the eternal, and offered prayers for their souls as the light began to fail, turning the distant forest into a wall of purple shadow. Brother Cuthbert sanded the fresh ink of his chronicle entry and closed the book. His back ached from the hours of stillness. He stood, rolling his stiff shoulders, and took a final look at Oakhaven. Cook fires were beginning to spark in the deepening twilight, tiny, hopeful stars mirroring those emerging above. The day's labour was done. The ploughs stood still. The dispute was, for now, set aside. In the quiet of his cell, he would join his brothers for vespers, their plain song a rising counterpart to the silent descent of night over the village. His world of ink, vellum, and measured contemplation was a different kind of work, a cultivation of the soul and the record. It did not fill a belly or mend a tool, but it sought to make sense of the struggle, to hold a fragile light against the great encompassing dark, one carefully scratched word, one observed detail, one prayer at a time. The scratching of quills was the sound of memory insisting on its place, a soft, persistent counterpoint to the grunt of the ox and the crack of the forge's hammer. The day dawned with a peculiar, breathless quality, the sky a pale, flawless bowl of eggshell. Blue, it was a day the entire village had worked towards, a pivot point in the year's slow turn. The fallow field, once a tangle of rest, now lay exposed and receptive, a vast expanse of dark, crumbled earth awaiting its purpose. Today, the seed would fly. From every cottage they came, not just the men who had guided the ploughs, but their wives and older children, even the elderly, who could still swing an arm. They gathered at the field's edge, a quiet congregation, each family carrying their precious, measured sacks of seed grain, barley for the heavier soil, oats for the lighter strips. The air hummed with a low, purposeful energy, a collective focus that felt almost sacred. The peasant farmer stood with his family, his wife beside him, his son and daughter clutching smaller bags. The seed within was more than food. It was tomorrow itself, a compact with the future, and handling it required a reverence usually reserved for church. He slung the heavy linen bag across his shoulder, the strap biting into his tunic. He dipped his hand deep into the sack, his fingers closing around a cool, smooth handful of barley seed. He brought it out, letting the grains trickle through his fingers in the morning light. They were pale gold, each one a hard, dry vessel of potential, a tiny sarcophagus holding a green ghost of life. They felt like polished stone, like hope made tangible. This was the moment of absolute faith, the surrender of their stored sustenance to the indifferent earth. The village priest, a thin man in a worn robe, stood at the headland. He raised his hands, not in a grand gesture, but in a simple, open-palmed invocation to the sky, the soil, and the saint who watched over crops. His Latin words were a murmur, most of the villagers understanding only the solemnity of the tone. He made the sign of the cross over the field, and with that silent blessing, the work began. They fanned out across the great field, each family moving to their assigned strips. There was no starting signal, only a communal, intuitive step forward. The peasant farmer began to walk, his body falling into the old rhythmic gait. With each step, his right arm swung out in a wide, practiced arc, his fingers opening just so. The seed flew from his hand in a golden sun-catching fan, a brief glittering shower that whispered as it fell onto the dark soil. It was a motion learned in childhood, a muscle memory passed down through generations. Not too high, or the wind would steal it. Not too hard, or it would clump and fail. It was a dance of the wrist and the walk, a slow, steady baptism of the earth. All around him, the same motion was repeated 100 times. The field became a tableau of swinging arms and scattering grain, a silent, synchronized ritual. The only sounds were the shush-shush of seed meeting soil, the soft crunch of footsteps on the tilth, and the distant, hopeful cries of rooks circling overhead. His wife walked a parallel path beside him, her own arm moving in a graceful, economical sweep. His son followed behind, his smaller hand mimicking the motion with serious concentration, filling in the gaps. Even his daughter, too young for a full bag, carried a little pouch and scattered seed along the edges. This was a communal act in its purest form, a shared investment of labor and hope where every hand, no matter how small, mattered. The sight was mesmerizing, the dark field gradually being dusted with a living gold, each strip receiving its measure of future, gradually being dusted with a living gold, each strip receiving its measure of future, 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 not its measure. The sun climbed, and the work settled into a meditative trance. The farmer's world narrowed to the strip before his feet. Before his feet, all the parents, the weight of the bag on his shoulder, the rhythmic swing of his arm. He felt the sweat begin to bead on his back under his tunic. He smelled the rich, damp earth and the dry, nutty scent of the barley seed. He saw the intricate topography of his strip, the slight rises, the shallow depressions where water might pool, and adjusted his throw accordingly. This intimate knowledge of every inch was his family's inheritance, written in soil and yield. To sow was to know, to care, to plead at midday. As the sun reached its zenith, a collective pause washed over the field. Bags were set down. The villagers converged at the headland, where the women who had finished their strips early had laid out a simple feast on rough woolen blankets. There was coarse, dark bread baked from last year's rye, wedges of hard, salty cheese from the communal dairy, and a small cask of weak, sour ale. They sat in loose clusters, not by family but in mixed groups, their tired bodies sinking onto the grass. The mood lifted, becoming light, almost festive. The shared labour forged a temporary equality, a camaraderie that softened the usual lines of worry and hierarchy. They ate with the earth-stained hands of creators, the bread tasting profoundly of sustenance, the ale washing away the dust of the field. They spoke little of the sowing itself. It was too large, too vital for casual words. Instead, they talked of the weather, of a fox in the hen house, of a child's first steps. The conversation was a lattice of normalcy built over the abyss of their dependence. The farmer sat chewing his bread and looked back over the field. Half of it now wore a faint golden stubble of seed. The sight filled him with a fierce, fragile pride. This was their collective mark upon the land, their signature in grain. But his eyes lifted to the sky, that flawless, empty blue. This was the gamble. The seed was in the earth's hand now. It needed a gentle rain to wake it, then steady sun to coax it. Up, too much rain would rot it. A late frost would blacken the first shoots. A dry wind could scorch the seedlings. Their hope, so physically invested today, was now hostage to the winds of clouds and air. The shared meal, the laughter, the ache in his sewing arm. All of it was a prayer offered to a silent, unpredictable God. The meal ended, and they returned to the field without fanfare. The afternoon passed in the same steady rhythm, the bags growing lighter, the sown strips multiplying, as the sun began to slant, casting long, dramatic shadows from the scattered sowers. The last of the seed flew. The farmer emptied his bag with a final sweeping arc, watching the last grains vanish into the brown. His shoulder aching, his hand raw. His shoulder aching, his hand raw. The field was complete. From margin to margin, the dark soil was now seeded, a vast silent repository of their labour and their anxiety. They walked home together in the amber evening light, their steps slower now, their energy spent. The tools of their faith, the empty sacks, were slung over tired shoulders. Behind them, the field lay quiet, holding its secret. The sowing was done. The vigil began. All they could do now was wait and watch the sky and hope that the earth, in its own time, would choose to answer their silent golden plea. The forest was a different kind of commons, a realm of shadow and bounty that stood in perpetual, brooding contrast to the open, ordered fields of Oakhaven, where the ploughed land spoke of human intention, of straight furrows and measured seed. The woods whispered of older, wilder laws. For the villagers, it was a vital pantry and a necessary larder, a place where their common rights, those ancient, fragile permissions, allowed them to glean what the untamed earth would provide. On a morning when the demands of the sown strips could briefly be set aside, the peasant farmer and his family turned their backs on the sunlit fields and walked toward the deep green gloom of the trees. They drove their 2 pigs before them, the animals snuffling and grunting with excited anticipation. These were forest-fed swine, lean and long-legged, their bristly backs a map of old scars from brambles and low branches. This practice, the pannage, was a rite as essential as the air they breathed. In the autumn, when the acorns and beechnuts lay thick on the leafy floor, the pigs would be loosed to fatten on the mast, their foraging turning wild bounty into winter salt pork and lard. Today, in the late spring, the forage was thinner, tender roots, fungi, early shoots, but it supplemented the meager household scraps and saved precious grain. The farmer carried a worn axe and a coil of rough rope. His wife bore a large shallow basket. His children followed, their eyes wide, for the forest edge was a place of both practical harvest and childhood wonder. Where every rustle might be a rabbit or a forester's ghost, they passed from the open meadow into the cool, dappled shade under the first great oaks. The change was immediate. The light turned green and liquid, filtering through a high canopy of just unfurled leaves. The air grew damp and rich with the scent of decaying leaves, damp moss and living sap. The sounds of the village, the distant clang from the forge, the call of a mother, fell away, swallowed by a profound, rustling silence, punctuated by the hammer tap of a woodpecker and the coo of a hidden dove. The pigs, released from their lead, immediately began rooting in the soft loam, their flat noses ploughing small, eager furrows in search of edible treasures. The farmer's first task was deadfall. His eyes, accustomed to the straight lines of the field, scanned the chaotic floor for fallen branches of a useful size. His right was to collect estovers, firewood for his hearth, but the rules were strict and ever-present in his mind. He could take only what was already down, and only of a certain girth. The standing timber, especially the great oaks and ashes, belonged to the lord for building ships or manor halls. He found a good-sized limb of ash, brought down by a winter storm, and set to work with his axe. The clean, splitting sound echoed sharply in the stillness, a proclamation of his presence. Each chunk of wood he added to his pile was a small victory against the coming cold, a tangible piece of security. His wife moved with a quieter purpose, a basket over her. She knew the mossy banks and sunny clearings as well as she knew her own garden. Her fingers, deft and sure, plucked the first wild strawberries, tiny rubies hidden under broad leaves. She gathered early wood sorrel, its clover-like leaves tart and refreshing, and patches of earthy golden chanterelle mushrooms that had sprung up after the recent rains. Each addition to her basket was a flavor, a vitamin, a break from the monotony of pottage and bread. This gathering was the woman's domain, a silent, skilled harvest that added subtle color and nutrition to their stark diet. Further in, where the sunlight broke through in shafts, she carefully cut young nettle tops with a knife, adding them to the haul for soup and poultices. The farmer, his wood gathered and bound, turned to another subtle art. From his pouch he took a length of finely twisted horsehair and a few slender, pliable switches of green hazel. In a quiet glade near a well-worn animal run, he fashioned a simple snare, a loop suspended with cunning lightness. This, too, walked a razor's edge of legality. Rabbits and birds from the forest could be taken, but the deer that moved like brown shadows through the deeper groves were the lord's property, their venison a luxury reserved for the manor table. Poaching a deer meant losing a hand, or worse. The snare he set was for conies, a risky but accepted supplement to their meals. Setting it, he felt the familiar tension, a blend of necessity and fear. It was a small defiance, a whisper against the Lord's absolute claim. It was then that a sound froze them all, not a natural sound, but the crisp snap of a trodden twig, too deliberate. The pigs stopped rooting. The children huddled closer to their mother. From between the grey trunks, a man emerged. He was the Lord's forester, a man named Hugh, and he wore the authority of his office like a second skin. He was clad in sturdy green wool, a longbow slung across his back, a heavy knife at his belt. His face was weathered and watchful, his eyes missing nothing, the size of the deadfall, the contents of the basket, the farmer's hand still holding the hazel switch. He did not speak at first, his gaze a physical weight. He walked slowly around their small camp, inspecting the pile of firewood, nudging it with his boot to ensure no greenwood was hidden within. He glanced into the basket of greens and fungi, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken laws and potential accusation. The forester's role was to be the Lord's eyes and fists in this green domain, to protect the valuable timber and the game. His presence was a cold reminder that the forest's bounty was a loan, not a gift, and that the line between common right and criminal theft was drawn by his judgment. Finally, his eyes settled on the farmer. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod toward the unfinished snare. "See, it is set for conies only," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "And mind the boundary stone. The coppice beyond is for the Lord's use this season." It was not a threat, but a warning. A reaffirmation of the boundaries that governed their lives even here, in the seeming wild. Then, with a last sweeping look, he turned and melted back into the trees, as silent as a stalking wolf. The family remained still for a long moment after he had gone. The magic of the forest had curdled, replaced by the old, familiar constraint. The farmer finished setting his snare with hurried hands, his earlier satisfaction gone. They gathered their things, the bound firewood, the basket of gleanings, and called the pigs. The walk back to the tree line was quicker, their steps eager for the open sky. As they emerged into the sunlight of the meadow, the farmer looked back at the wall of trees. It was a place of life, of supplement and survival. But it was not free. Its shadows held not just mushrooms and mast, but the longer shadow of the manor, a reminder that every stick of firewood, every handful of berries, every rabbit taken, existed on the sufferance of a distant lord. The forest edge was both a refuge and a proving ground, where their precarious autonomy was measured, branch by branch, against the iron weight of feudal law. They returned to their cottage with their modest harvest, the forest's gifts in their hands, and its watchful, silent warning lodged deep in their hearts. The rain began not as a storm, but as a sigh, a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to seep from the low, wool-grey sky itself. For a day it was a relief, settling the dust of the sowing and promising the gentle drink the buried seed required. But the sigh did not cease. It deepened into a steady cold downpour that lasted a second day, then a third. The world dissolved into a monochrome of wet greens and mud browns. The cheerful streams around Oakhaven swelled into angry churning torrents, their banks overflowing to lick at the lower pastures. The village paths became quagmires, sucking at boots and hooves with a greedy clay-thick insistence. And still the rain fell. Inside the cottages, the constant drumming on thatch was a sound that slowly frayed the nerves. Dampness became a state of being. Dampness became a state of being. Clothes hung from rafters never fully dried, acquiring a musty, mildewed smell. The hearth fire, usually a beacon of warmth and cheer, fought a losing battle against the chill damp that seeped through walls, smoking and sputtering as if in protest, but the true anxiety lay outside, in the fields. The peasant farmer stood daily at the edge of his strip, a sack over his head, against the deluge, and stared at the earth. The dark soil, so carefully turned and sown, was now a saturated, pudding-like morass. In a few places where the water pooled, a faint sickly green fuzz had appeared, not the robust spear tips of barley shoots, but the first hint of algae, a fief of light and air. His hope so recently cast upon the land felt waterlogged, drowning under the endless, weeping sky. On the fourth day of the unceasing rain, the herbal healer, Agnes, left her fragrant cottage and walked through the downpour to the common field. She did not look at the sky. She looked down, kneeling in the mud with a grim focus. With careful fingers, she probed at the edge of a sown strip, digging down an inch or two beside where a seed should be. What she brought up was not a firm, swelling kernel, but a pale, softened thing, its shell slowing away into a foul-smelling paste. Root rot. The word passed through the village not as a shout, but as a cold whisper, carried from doorway to doorway with the rain. It was the blight they feared most after sowing, a silent killer working beneath the surface, turning promise into putrid mush before it ever saw the sun. Her warning was a quiet confirmation of their dread, a diagnosis of a sickness in the very womb of the earth. Helplessness was a taste, metallic and sour, at the back of every throat. They could not drain the fields. Their labor, their seed, their future was at the mercy of a whim they could neither understand nor appease. This low-grade, constant fear of famine was the oldest shadow in their lives, a shape that lurked at the edge of every season. It was not the dramatic fear of battle or beast, but a slow, grinding anxiety that gnawed at the edges of thought, turning every glance at the larder into a calculation, every meal into a cautious rationing of an uncertain supply. On the seventh day, a Sunday, the call went out. The village would gather in the church. It was not a decision. It was a reflex, as instinctive as huddling for warmth. The small stone church, usually cold and echoing, was packed, bodies steaming in the damp air, the smell of wet wool and unwashed humanity overpowering the usual scent of old incense. The priest, his face drawn, stood before the rough-hewn altar. He did not preach of sin or salvation, but of supplication. His voice, thin against the drumming on the slate roof, led them in the ancient litany for fair weather, the Latin phrases rising in a ragged, desperate chorus. They prayed not for a miracle, but for a return to normalcy, for the simple, merciful operation of the seasons they understood. The farmer knelt on the cold stone floor, his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. His prayer was wordless, a raw, silent plea rising from a place deeper than faith or reason, from the animal instinct to feed his children. Around him, the murmured prayers were a hum of shared vulnerability, a fragile raft of collective hope launched against the indifferent flood. High in his scriptorium, Brother Cuthbert watched the rain sheeting across his window, obscuring the view of Oakhaven in a grey veil. He dipped his quill and opened the house chronicle to a fresh page. His entry was meticulous, devoid of the anxiety that choked the village below, yet freighted with its weight. Anno Domini 1347, the month of April. Unseasonable and continual rains have beset the valley for 7 days now. The streams are in spate, and the low fields lie under water. The seed, newly sown, is in peril of corruption. A great anxiety is upon the people of Oakhaven, who gathered in the church this day to implore divine intervention for fair weather. He sanded the ink, his hand steady. His record was an anchor of fact in the storm of fear, a testament that this trial too would be noted would become a line in the long story of this place. He offered his own, quieter prayers, but his primary duty was witness, to observe, to record, to ensure that even if the crop failed, the fact of their fear and their faith would not be lost. In the days that followed, faith was supplemented by grim, small-scale preparation. The helplessness began to curdle into a stubborn, practical energy. Men who could do nothing for the fields turned to other tasks. The peasant farmer, his strip a lost cause for the moment, joined others in reinforcing the banks of the stream where it threatened the cottages, piling stones and weaving wattles in a futile seeming but necessary gesture of defiance against the water. His wife and the other women, under Agnes's direction, began to gather and dry every edible green they could find in the less flooded margins: nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, building a reserve of bitter, leafy insurance against a thin harvest. The blacksmith, his forge fire hissing in the damp, worked on repairing tools for the work that might yet come, if the sun returned. These acts were prayers in action, a declaration that they would not simply wait to be erased. They were planting stakes in the future, however frail. The rain did not stop, but on the 10th day it lessened. The downpour became a drizzle, then a mist, and finally in the late afternoon, a pale, watery light broke through the thinning clouds. It was not sun, not truly, but a mere lightening of the gloom. Yet to the villagers peering from their doors, it was a sign. A fragile, tremulous hope, thinner than the light itself, stirred in the sodden air. The wheel of the year had not broken. It had merely stuck in the mud. They watched the sky, their exhaustion laced with a wary, desperate patience. The first blight was not a harvest of death, but a season of waiting, a lesson in the sheer passive power of the sky and in the small, stubborn acts of preparation and plea by which humanity weathered the long, damp silence between sowing and sun. The rains did cease. The clouds, having wrung themselves empty, retreated to the horizon and dissolved. In their place rose a sun that seemed intent on making amends for its long absence. It burned with a fierce, uncompromising clarity, bleaching the sky to a pale, heat-hazed blue and pouring a molten gold over the drenched world. The land steamed. Mist rose from the sodden fields in great spectral veils each dawn, burned away by mid-morning into a shimmering, heavy heat. The relief in Oakhaven was profound. a collective exhalation that loosened shoulders and brought the first genuine smiles in weeks. But the reprieve was not a rest, it was a starting pistol. The sun's return unleashed a different tyranny, the relentless, urgent tyranny of growth, and the brutal labour required to shepherd it. The sown field, so recently a quagmire, erupted. The barley and oats, having survived the drowning, now shot upwards as if making up for lost time. Within days, the dark earth vanished beneath a sea of vibrant, waist-high green, a rustling, living carpet that whispered in the slightest breeze. It was a beautiful, heart-lifting sight, a testament to the earth's resilient generosity. A testament to the earth's resilient generosity, yet within that beauty lay the season's first great burden, the weeds, spurred by the same rains and sun. They rose with a vicious opportunistic vigour, tough-stemmed dock, insidious chickweed, the clinging tendrils of bindweed, threatening to choke the life from the precious grain. The work of the early summer became a war of attrition fought on 100 narrow fronts. The peasant farmer and his family took to the strips at first light, before the sun's heat became a hammer. They moved in a bent-backed procession, their hands flying, tearing the unwanted plants from the soil by their roots. There was no tool for this but the human hand, no method but patience and endless repetition. The work was monotonous, hypnotic, and ceaseless. The green rose stretched ahead, an illusion of infinity. The farmer's world shrank to the few feet of earth before his knees, the smell of crushed greenery and dry soil, the sting of sweat in his eyes. His back became a single, solid ache, a permanent fixture of the season. His wife worked beside him, her fingers just as swift, a kerchief tied over her hair. Their children followed, learning the shapes of the enemy plants, their small hands contributing to the collective defense. It was silent, grinding work, a daily surrender of the body to the demands of the field. The sun climbed, and the heat pressed down, a physical weight. Insects buzzed in the still air. The only sounds were the rustle of grain, the soft thump of discarded weeds, and the occasional weary sigh as the grain swelled in its sheath. Other tasks overlapped, weaving a complex tapestry of communal labor. The village's small flock of sheep, their winter wool, grown long and heavy, were driven to the common pound. Shearing day was a festival of sorts, a brief, focused burst of shared effort with a tangible reward. Men skilled with the iron shears worked in teams, flipping the bleating animals onto their backs, the blades moving in smooth, practiced strokes to peel away the dense oily fleeces. In a single, curling mat, the air filled with the lanolin scent of wool and the warm animal smell of the sheep. Women and children gathered the fleeces, rolling them and packing them into sacks for later spinning or for trade. It was hard, dirty work, but it was communal, punctuated by shouts and laughter, a reminder that not all summer toil was solitary. Then came the haymaking. This was the most urgent, back-breaking labor of high summer, a race against time and weather. The meadow grasses on the common land had grown tall, and seed-headed a lush green-gold reservoir of winter fodder for the livestock. When the steward judged the weather set fair, the word went out and every able soul in Oakhaven converged on the meadow. The men, their scythes freshly whetted by the smith, moved in a staggered line, each swing a long, sweeping arc that laid the grass in a neat, fallen swash. The sound was a persistent, rhythmic swish-thump, the sound of summer being harvested. The sun blazed on their bare backs and shoulders, and the sweat poured from them. soaking their hose and plastering their hair to their scalps. Behind the mowers came the women and older children, turning the cut grass with wooden rakes to ensure it dried evenly in the sun, their own movements a dance of stooping and straightening. The air in the meadow grew thick with the sweet, dusty, sun-baked perfume of curing grass and the tongue of sweat. There was no leisurely midday meal. They ate bread and cheese standing in the shade of a hedgerow, gulping sour ale, their eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the clouds that could ruin the hay with a sudden shower. The work was frantic, a marathon of coordinated motion, the entire village functioning as a single organism, focused on a single vital task. After 2 days of cutting and turning, when the hay was crisp and rustling, they gathered it. Using pitchforks, they built it into great teetering stacks on wooden sledges, which the oxen, patient as ever, hauled back to the village to be stored in the loft of every buyer. The farmer's muscles screamed at night, a symphony of exhaustion, but there was a grim satisfaction in the full hayloft, a guarantee that the ox and cow would eat through the winter, that the wheel could turn again. It was in the midst of this season of strain that the ever-present risk of their existence made itself plain. At the forge, the blacksmith, fatigued from a day of repairing scythe blades and sharpening shears, misjudged a strike. The glowing iron horseshoe twisted as his hammer descended, and a glancing blow sent a sliver of scalding metal searing across the back of his left hand. He cursed, a sharp, guttural sound, and plunged the hand into the quenching barrel. The pain was immediate and fierce, but worse was the cold fear that followed as he examined the wound. A deep, angry burn that would render the hand useless for days, perhaps weeks. He sat heavily on his anvil block, cradling the injured hand, his face ashen, not from pain alone, but from calculation. No work meant no barter meant no grain. An injury was more than a personal agony. It was a crack in the foundation of a family's survival, a stark reminder that their world was built upon the fragile, fallible strength of their own bodies. The summer sun demanded everything, and in its fierce light, the margin for misfortune was revealed to be terrifyingly thin. The village would help, as it always did, sharing tasks and food. But the lesson hung in the hot, still air of the forge. Every swing of the hammer, or every pull of the scythe, every bent back in the field, was a gamble with a debt that could be called due in a flash of pain, a slip, a moment of weariness. The toll was taken in sweat, in ache, and always in the shadow of potential ruin. The heat of high summer lay heavy upon the monastery hill, a palpable blanket that stilled the air and drew the scent of hot stone and dried time from the earth. In the scriptorium, Brother Cuthbert worked with the window shutter, propped open, seeking a breeze that did not come. The fir, the cough, and a script-out tour. View of Oakhaven was hazy, the fields shimmering as if underwater. The villagers' tiny, slow-moving specks engaged in the distant, silent labor of haymaking. The only sound was the dry scratch of his quill, copying a passage on the humoral theory of autumn ailments. The peace was absolute, a distillation of the season's languor, and it made the sudden, frantic pounding at the monastery's great oak gate sound like the crack of doom. Brother Cuthbert started, a blot of ink falling from his quill to mar the parchment. The pounding came again. Not the measured knock of a pilgrim or a messenger, but a desperate, irregular drumming that spoke of exhaustion or terror. Setting aside his work, He rose and made his way down the worn stone stairs, through the cool, dim cloister, and into the sun-drenched courtyard. The gatekeeper, old Brother Paul, was already shuffling toward the gate, his face a mask of annoyed suspicion. He drew back the heavy iron bolt and pulled one side of the gate open just enough to peer out. The man who stood in the blinding sunlight was less a traveller than a spectre of travel. He was gaunt to the point of emaciation. His clothes, once a merchant's decent wool, hanging from his frame in filthy, tattered rags. Dust coated his skin and hair, giving him the grey look of a clay figurine. His eyes, sunk deep in shadowed sockets, held a feverish, desperate light. He leaned heavily against the gatepost, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, as if the climb up the hill had nearly finished him. The smell that wafted from him was complex. Old sweat, road filth, and beneath it, a sweet, sickly odour that raised the hairs on Brother Cuthbert's neck. The man tried to speak, but his voice was a cracked whisper. He swallowed, tried again. He spoke of towns to the east, names unfamiliar to the monks, places a week's hard travel or more beyond the known market towns. His words tumbled out in a broken stream. He spoke of a sickness, a pestilence that did not discriminate. It felled the strong man at the plough as surely as the babe in the cradle, the lady in her manor as the beggar in the ditch. He described fevers that burned like hellfire, swellings in the groin, and armpits as large as apples. Black blotches that bloomed on the skin like rotten flowers. People died so fast, he whispered. There were not enough living to bury them. The streets were silent, but for the cries of the dying and the slow, grim roll of death cards. He had fled, leaving everything, walking by night, hiding by day, driven by a terror that had outpaced his strength. Brother Cuthbert listened, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He had read of great plagues in the chronicles, divine scourges that swept kingdoms clean. They were tales from a distant past or foreign lands, moral lessons inscribed on parchment. This man's horror was present, immediate, and carried on his own reeking breath. The monk's first duty was charity. His second, a duty to his brothers in the village below, was prudence. He exchanged a glance with Brother Paul, whose suspicion had hardened into fear. They would give the stranger shelter, but not entry. Brother Cuthbert instructed the gatekeeper to fetch a pitcher of small beer, a loaf of yesterday's bread, and a blanket. He himself addressed the traveller, his voice calm but firm. The man could not enter the cloister. There was a barn, a stone's throw from the monastery walls, used for storing hay. He could rest there. Water would be brought, food would be left at the door. It was isolation, but it was sanctuary. The man seemed beyond caring about the terms. He nodded. A feeble dip of his chin, his energy spent in the telling. He allowed himself to be led, stumbling, to the small, windowless barn. The door was heavy oak. Once he was inside, Brother Cuthbert closed it, dropping a simple wooden bar into place. Not to imprison, but to quarantine. The sound of the bar falling was terribly final in the hot, still afternoon. Back in the scriptorium, the world had changed. The haze over Oakhaven no longer seemed peaceful, but ominous. The monk's earlier entry on autumnal humours felt trivial, obscene. He took a fresh sheet of parchment. His hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he dated the entry. He wrote of the traveller's arrival, of his appearance, and his account. He recorded the provision of shelter and the fact of isolation. His words were sparse, factual, but between each line screamed the unspoken terror. He did not name the sickness. He did not need to. The chronicle was now a watchman's log, and the first warning had been posted. 2 days later, the rumours reached Oakhaven. They arrived not with the solemnity of a monk's record, but with the garish, unreliable flair of a peddler named Jack, whose pack was full of ribbons, needles, and tall tales. He set up his board on the green at dusk. As the villagers returned from the fields, he had news from the east, he announced, his voice a practiced mix of gossip and showmanship. Strange tales, fearful tales, a great mortality in the cathedral cities, bodies piled in pits, whole villages standing empty, their doors swinging in the wind. Some said it was a judgment, others a poison in the air. Some said it was a judgment, others a poison in the air. He had seen a man himself, he claimed, his eyes wide, who had coughed and fallen down dead in the market at Casterton, his skin black as soot. The villagers listened, their tired faces settling into expressions of wary skepticism. Peddlers' tales were as cheap as their trinkets, often inflated to make the teller seem a bearer of grand, worldly knowledge. They had their own realities, the ache in their backs from haymaking, the worry over a cow that might be going dry, the relentless pressure of the sun on the ripening grain. Yet, beneath the skepticism, a subtle dread began to permeate the summer air. The stories were too specific, too grimly uniform. They remembered the strange, gaunt pilgrim who had been seen climbing the monastery hill and had not been seen coming down. Whispers passed over supper bowls that night. The herbal healer, Agnes, hearing the talk, went to her garden and looked long at her patch of rue and wormwood, herbs she used sparingly for cleansing and protection. She said nothing, but her silence was more potent than the peddler's chatter. In the days that followed, the dread was a subtle undertone, a minor key in the symphony of summer labor. A mother pulled her child a little closer when a stranger passed on the track. Men meeting at the well spoke less of the weather and more of the odd silence of the birds, or a dream they'd had. The laughter during the evening gathering at the green was slightly forced, the pauses between stories a fraction too long. The shadow cast by the stranger on the monastery hill was long and thin, and though the sun still blazed, it seemed to many that it shone with a colder, more brittle light. The wheel of the year still turned, the grain ripened, the work demanded, but now each day was edged with a new silent question. The shadow had been cast. All Oakhaven now waited, unconsciously holding its breath, for the other shoe to drop. The traveller died in the deep of the trowel. Night. There was no final cry, no dramatic rattle. Brother Cuthbert, bringing a fresh pitcher of water and a bowl of thin gruel at dawn, found him still and cold on the straw. The man's face, in death, had lost its frantic tension, settling into a hollow calm that was more terrible than his earlier agitation. The sweet, sickly odour in the small barn had intensified, now mingling with the blunt, flat scent of voided bowels. The monk stood in the doorway, the morning light cutting a bright slab across the dirt floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing above the corpse. He made the sign of the cross, his lips moving in the automatic prayer for the dead. but his mind was already racing through the prescribed practical rites of pestilence. Speed and fire were the watchwords. There would be no vigil, no washing of the body, no procession to the churchyard. Such tenderness was a luxury that could condemn the living. Brother Cuthbert fetched 2 other brothers, their faces pale above their brown robes, and gave them strict instructions. They wrapped the body in the very straw upon which it lay, then rolled it into the coarse blanket that had been its only comfort. They carried this anonymous, shroud-wrapped bundle on a hurdle out of the barn. Their steps hurried, their eyes averted. The monastery had a small walled plot of land set aside for such purposes, far from the main garden and the well. Here, they had already dug a pit, deep and straight-sided. The bundle was lowered without ceremony. Quicklime, harsh and white, was shoveled over it in a choking cloud that smelled of pure chemical negation. Then the earth was returned, covering the stranger and his story, sealing his horror under a mound of raw soil. The whole affair, from discovery to burial, took less than an hour. The sun was barely clear of the hills. The monastic day continued with its offices. Prime, terce, the chanting of psalms, but the rhythm felt hollow, a fragile incantation, against a threat that had just been physically interred, but spiritually unleashed. Word of the death seeped down to Oakhaven, not as an announcement, but as a cold certainty that travelled through the village like groundwater. The monk who brought eggs to the market cross did not speak of it, but his avoidance of the usual pleasantries, the way he would not meet anyone's eye, told the tale plainly enough. The stranger was gone, and the manner of his going confirmed every dark rumour. In her cottage under the oak, Agnes the healer received the unspoken news with a grim nod. She spent the afternoon in her garden and in the damp margins of the forest, her basket growing heavy with specific bitter greenery. She gathered great bundles of wormwood, its silvery leaves pungent and sharp, known to cleanse the air. She picked rue, a powerful herb with a protective reputation, its scent acrid and cleansing. Lavender, for its sweetness and its use in strewing over foul floors, was harvested and tied in bunches. These were not herbs for fevers or wounds. These were herbs for miasma, for corruption, for an invisible poison on the wind. She hung them in her cottage, their drying smells layering over the usual fragrant tapestry, creating a new defensive perfume. She began to prepare small sachets, cloth pouches filled with the dried mix, not yet distributing them, but stockpiling them like arrows before a siege no one could see. The official response came from the manor. Within 2 days of the burial, the Lord Steward returned to Oakhaven, but this time he did not bring tally sticks. He came with 4 men-at-arms, their faces hard under their kettle hats, and a scribe. They did not gather the villagers. They simply nailed a notice, written on a scrap of parchment, to the door of the church. The priest, his voice unsteady, read it aloud to the small crowd that gathered. It was an order, curt and absolute, by the command of the lord of the manor, and for the preservation of the tenantry and the demesne. Movement to and from the village of Oakhaven was henceforth restricted. No peddlers or travellers were to be given shelter. No villager was to travel to the market at Casterton or beyond without the steward's express permission. Any person found entering the village from the east road was to be turned away at spear point. The words pestilence and plague were never used. The order spoke only of contagion and prudent safeguard. Its meaning was crystalline. Oakhaven was to become an island. The feudal contract, usually a one-way extraction of labor and grain, now revealed another facet, the Lord's responsibility, however self-interested, to protect his human assets. The walls of the world, once stretching to the horizon of a day's walk, now shrank to the boundaries of the parish. The psychological weight of this new reality was immense, a pressure that settled over the village more suffocating than the summer heat. The approaching threat was invisible, which made it omnipresent. Every cough from a child at play, every complaint of a headache after a day in the sun, every slight fever was now scrutinized with a new, terrified intensity. The cheerful greetings between neighbors became guarded, eyes searching for signs of flush or lethargy. The communal well, once a hub of gossip, saw quicker, quieter visits. People drew their water and retreated, the unspoken fear hanging between them like a veil. Work in the fields continued. The grain, now turning from green to gold, demanded it. But the usual camaraderie was gone. The men worked in isolated clusters, the sound of their scythes seeming lonely in the vast, quiet landscape. The laughter that had sometimes risen from the meadow during haymaking was absent, replaced by a focused, grim silence. The villagers prepared, but their preparations were quiet, internal, and grim. They checked their stores of food with a new urgency, calculating how long they could last if truly cut off. They mended their cottages, stuffing gaps in the wattle with fresh clay, as if trying to seal out not just the weather, but the very air itself. They looked at their children with a painful, fierce love tinged with a new kind of fear, the shadow of the stranger, which had first fallen on the monastery hill, now stretched over every home. It was a shadow without a clear shape, born of rumor, confirmed by a hasty burial, and made law by a hasty burial, and made law by a nailed parchment. Life went on, but it was now a life lived on borrowed time, under a silent, watchful sky. The wheel of the year still turned towards harvest, but the familiar cycle felt fragile, as if the next revolution might not bring renewal, but a terrible final stillness. They waited, trapped between the ripening gold of their fields and the invisible, gathering dark, their world reduced to a waiting room. Their prayers no longer for sun or rain, but for simple, desperate containment. The anxiety that had permeated Oakhaven all summer did not lift with the turning of the season. It merely changed its shape, hardening from a diffused red into a sharp, frantic focus. The grain was ready. The barley stood tall, its bearded heads nodding heavy in gold. The oats rippled in silvery green waves, rustling with a sound like dry whispers. It was a bounty, a testament to the earth's resilience and their own back-breaking labor. Yet the sight brought no joy, only a desperate urgency. The harvest was no longer just the culmination of the year's work. It was a race against the first autumn storms that could flatten the crop, a race against the grain becoming overripe and shedding its precious kernels to the ground, and a race against the invisible, creeping shadow that made every day feel borrowed. Every grain counted now with a terrible amplified weight. The harvest began not at dawn, but in the grey pre-light, when the stars were still visible pinpricks in a cold sky. The peasant farmer rose from a sleep that had been thin and troubled. He sharpened his sickle with a smooth whetstone, the rhythmic shink-shink sound a grim overture to the day. His hands, already calloused and cracked from a season of weeding and haymaking, tested the newly honed edge. It needed to be perfect. A dull blade meant wasted effort. A crushed stalk, a precious head of grain lost. His wife and children rose with him, moving in the dark cottage with a silent shared purpose. They ate a hurried meal of cold porridge, their minds already in the field. Outside, the village was stirring, a congregation of shadows gathering tools and shouldering sacks. There were no shouted greetings, only nods, their faces set in lines of grim determination. The spectre at their backs needed no name. It was present in the haste of their movements, in the way their eyes scanned the eastern horizon, not for weather, but for some sign of the unspeakable. They reached their strips as the first pale light seeped into the world, turning the field from a dark sea into a vast seek, into a vast, dark sea, into a vast, dark sea, shimmering plain of gold. The farmer took his position at the edge of his barley. He bent, seized a thick handful of stalks with his left hand, and with his right, he swept the sickle in a low, smooth arc. The sound was a crisp, satisfying swish, followed by the rustle of the cut stalks falling into the crook of his arm. It was the first cut of the harvest, and it felt less like a celebration and more like the first move in a vital, desperate salvage operation. He worked quickly, his body settling into the ancient, rhythmic motion. Bend, grasp, swing, step. Bend, grasp, swing, step. Bend, grasp, swing, step. Bend, grasp, swing, step, swing. The world narrowed to the swath of grain before him, the growing weight in his arm, the accumulating pile of cut stalks at his feet. His family moved in behind him. His wife and eldest son followed, gathering the fallen sheaves and binding them with deft twists of straw into neat, manageable stooks. His younger children carried water and gathered any stray heads that had fallen, their small fingers meticulous in the stubble. It was a family economy of motion, a silent, efficient machine honed by generations. All around them the same scene was repeated across the great field, the air still cool, filled with the rhythmic sounds of 100 sickles cutting, the rustle of grain, the soft thump of bound sheaves. But the usual harvest song, the occasional call between strips, was absent. The silence was profound, broken only by the sounds of work and the distant, ominous cawing of rooks gathering in the nearby trees, waiting for their chance at the scattered kernels. The sun climbed, and the coolness burned away, replaced by a punishing late summer heat that seemed to press down from the cloudless sky. The farmer's tunic was soon soaked through with sweat. Plaster to his back, the dust from the dry stalks and the chaff filled the air, coating his skin and catching in his throat. His muscles, already weary from the summer's toll, began to scream in protest, a burning ache in the lower back from the constant bending, a deep fatigue in the shoulders and arms from the repetitive swinging. He did not stop. He drank sparingly from the leather flask his daughter brought, his eyes never leaving the uncut grain ahead. Every swing of the sickle was a kernel saved, a fraction of security harvested against the uncertain winter. The physical exhaustion was not just palpable, it was a currency willingly spent, each ounce of strength traded for another handful of gold. Midday came and went without a true break. They ate bread and cheese standing in the shade of their own piled sheaves, their eyes scanning the remaining work. The farmer watched the Lord's reeve, a man named Talbot, who had taken up a position on a small rise at the field's edge. He sat on his horse, a ledger open on the pommel of his saddle, his gaze sweeping methodically over the harvesters. He was not watching the labor. He was calculating. His sharp eyes estimated the yield of each strip, the thickness of the sheaves, the density of the heads. He was the human instrument of the Lord's due, and his silent tally was the prelude to the reckoning to come. The farmer felt that gaze like a physical weight. The grain he cut was not yet his. A portion belonged to the church's tithe, a tenth of the yield for the support of the priest and the upkeep of God's house. A larger, more significant portion belonged to the Lord as rent for the very soil under his feet. The reeve's presence was a constant reminder that this frantic personal struggle was also a performance for an audience with a prior claim. The prior claim. The bull's pear afternoon was a blur of heat, dust, and aching repetition. The farmer's world dissolved into a sun-hazed tunnel of golden stalks and the metronome of his own labor. His hands, inside their rough leather gloves, grew raw and blistered. A deep thirst settled in his throat, unquenched by the warm, metallic-tasting water. His wife's face, when he glanced back, was streaked with sweat and dust, her expression one of pure endurance. The children lagged, their smaller bodies flagging, but they did not complain. They understood the stakes in the weary set of their parents' shoulders. As the sun began its long slide toward the western tree line, casting the field in a deep, honeyed light, the farmer made the final cut on his strip. The last stalks of barley fell. He straightened, a groan escaping his lips as his spine protested the sudden change. He looked at the expanse of stubble, dotted with the neat conical stooks of his harvest. A wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like nausea washed over him. But beneath it, beneath the ache and the dust and the fear, was a thin, hard vein of satisfaction. It was in. Against the rain, against the shadow, against his own failing body, the grain was cut and bound. The work was not done. The sheaves needed to be loaded onto the ox cart and hauled to the barn. But that could wait for the cooler evening. For now he stood amidst the evidence of his family's survival. The golden stooks like small, sturdy fortresses in the fading light. The reeve nudged his horse and moved off toward the manor, his ledger full of numbers. His ledger full of numbers. The tithe and the rent would be collected soon enough. That was tomorrow's burden. Today's had been borne. The farmer wiped his sweaty face with a grimy forearm, leaving a darker streak. He looked at his blistered hands, then at his family, their faces shadowed with fatigue. They had met the first, frantic demand of the autumn. They had harvested the hope they had sown in the spring under a cloud of fear. It was a grim accomplishment, devoid of festival, but it was real. The grain was cut. The reckoning could now begin. The threshing floor was a circle of hard-packed earth behind the peasant farmer's cottage, swept clean of stones and chaff from seasons past. Here, in the days following the frantic cutting, the harvest entered its second, more deliberate phase. The golden stooks were carted in from the field and stacked in a loose ring around the perimeter, a wall of bound potential. The farmer, his body still aching from the reaping, now took up the flail, 2 lengths of stout ashwood joined by a leather hinge. now took up the flail, 2 lengths of stout ashwood joined by a leather hinge. It was a simple, brutal tool, an instrument of transformation. He spread a sheaf of barley across the hard ground, its stalks crackling underfoot. Then he began. The rhythm was different from the sickle's swing, a measured, overhead arc, a sharp crack as the swiping end of the flail struck the dried stalks, a rustle as he turned the sheaf with his foot, thwack, rustle, thwack, rustle. It was monotonous, percussive work, raising a cloud of dust and fine chaff that coated everything in a golden haze. With each blow, the precious kernels were beaten from their husks, scattering across the hard earth. His wife worked beside him, using a wooden fork to toss and turn the straw, ensuring every head was broken open. The air filled with the dry, sweet smell of released grain and the peppery dust of broken stems. It was slow, patient labor, a reduction of the field's bounty to its essential edible core. The pile of loose grain grew in the center of the circle, a modest, tawny hill. The burr, straw, now useless for food, but vital for thatch and bedding, was set aside in a separate stack. After threshing came the winnowing. This required a day with a steady breeze, and they waited, watching the sky until a consistent wind blew from the west. The farmer carried the mixed pile of grain and chaff to a large, flat woven basket standing at the edge of the threshing floor. He lifted the basket and, with a practiced, tossing motion, poured its contents out into the wind. It was a moment of pure alchemy. The lighter husks and bits of straw, the chaff, were caught by the breeze and carried away in a glittering cloud, drifting to settle uselessly on the grass beyond. The heavier, good grain fell in a concentrated shower almost straight down, collecting in a cleaner, denser pile at his feet. Over and over he repeated the toss, the wind doing the work of 1,000 careful fingers, separating the nourishment from the waste. His children chased the blowing chaff, laughing for the first time in weeks, a brief, bright sound against the serious work. The farmer watched the golden kernels accumulate, his face grim. This was the true measure, stripped of all illusion. This pile, and no more, was what the year had yielded. The final reckoning arrived on a cool grey morning when the steward's man, the Reeve Talbot, returned. He came with a servant carrying a set of brass-bound wooden measures and the Lord's great canvas sacks. The farmer's family stood silently by as the official process began. First, the tithe for the church. The Reeve scooped the dry barley into the standard bushel measure, heaping it, then levelling it off with a straight stick. 1 bushel in every 10 was poured not into the Lord's sack, but into a separate one for the priest. The farmer watched each scoop leave his pile. It was a substantial subtraction, 1/10 of his hope given to God, or rather, to the institution that mediated God. He thought of the prayers in the rain-swept church, the pleas for sun. This was the price of those pleas, the earthly cost of heavenly attention. Then came the Lord's share. This was larger, dictated by the ancient custom of the manor. For the strip he farmed, the rent was 1/3 of the remaining yield. The measure dipped again, the grain rustling as it was transferred. The farmer's wife looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. This was the grain that would fill the Lord's granary, that might be sold at market or brewed into ale for the manor house. That represented the days of labour he had spent on the demesne, now made manifest, The physical removal of it was a silent, powerful articulation of the feudal bond, the soil's fruit flowing uphill as inevitably as water. Next, and most sacred, was the seed corn. Before any thought of food for the winter, next year's promise had to be secured. From the now shrinking pile, the farmer himself carefully measured out the amount he would need to sow his strip again come spring. This grain was set apart with reverence, poured into a special, vermin-proof chest that would be stored in the loft. It was the non-negotiable investment in the future, the kernel of the next turn of the wheel. To eat the seed corn was the final, desperate sin, the admission that the cycle had broken. Finally, the reeve and his servants stepped back. The measuring was done. The farmer looked at what remained. The pile was meager. It represented the total sustenance for his family, his cow, and his ox for the entire winter, and the lean spring until the first greens appeared. He mentally divided it. So much for bread, so much for pottage, so much to be ground into coarse flour, so much kept back for the animals to keep them strong for ploughing. The calculations were tight, familiar, and sobering. There was enough. After the tithe, after the rent, after the seed was set aside, there was just enough to survive, assuming no spoilage, no unexpected mouth to feed, no prolonged sickness. There was no surplus, no grain to sell. For a new iron pot or a length of cloth, no margin for a feast at Christmas, only the usual modest observance. The harvest, which had looked so abundant waving in the field, had been distilled down to this precise, precarious equation of survival. The reeve tied the Lord's sacks and loaded them onto a pack horse. He nodded once, a transaction completed, and led the animal away down the track toward the manor. The tithe sack was left for the priest's boy to collect later. The farmer and his family were left alone with their portion. The silence was heavy, but not despairing. He knelt and ran a hand through the cool, smooth grain, feeling its solid reality. Despite the poor spring, the blight of rain, the shadow of pestilence, the obligations had been met. The earth had yielded its due to God, to the Lord, and finally, just barely, to the one who worked it. A sense of grim accomplishment settled over him, a fatigue that was more than physical. It was the weariness of a narrow passage navigated. They had not prospered, but they had endured. The reckoning was fair, according to the ancient, unforgiving rules of their world. They had survived the year. As the first cold spit of autumn rain began to fall, darkening the stones of the threshing floor, he and his wife began the work of carrying their winter life indoors, sack by careful sack, into the dim safety of the barn. 4 or 5 sack into the dim safety of the barn. 4 sack here, into the dim safety of the barn. 4 sack here, into the dim safety of the way. Harvest was over. The accounting was closed. Now came the keeping. The first frosts arrived, not with a storm, but with a silent, crystalline exhalation. One morning, the peasant farmer woke to a world transformed. Every blade of grass, every fallen leaf, every thatched roof in Oakhaven was furred with a delicate, glittering rime. The air, when he opened the door, was a knife blade of coal, so sharp and clean, it felt purifying after the damp, fearful miasma of autumn. The world had contracted. The vast, demanding theatre of the fields was now a blank white page. The forest edge was a stark lattice of black branches against the grey sky. Life which had flowed outward all year now drew inward, retreating to the one fixed point of warmth and light, the cottage hearth. Inside, the world was small, close, and amber-hued. The fire was no longer just for cooking. It was the sun of their domestic universe, its light dancing on the smoke-blackened rafters, its heat a palpable presence that pushed back the cold seeping through the door walls. The farmer's family gathered around it, their movements slowed to the pace of the season. This was the time of repair, of maintenance, of tending to the tools and textiles that sustained them. The farmer brought in the worn plowshare, its edge nicked from a season of biting flint, with a smooth river stone and a pot of precious hog's fat. He began to hone it. The rhythmic scrape a quiet, purposeful sound. Nearby his wife sat with a drop spindle, a cloud of raw, greasy wool beside her. She would tease a strand, attach it to the spindle, and set it twisting, her fingers feeding the wool as it spun into a strong, coarse thread. The spindle whirled and dipped, a hypnotic dance that would, over the long weeks, become enough yarn to knit hose or weave a blanket. Their son worked at a simpler task, softening strips of willow with water to weave into a new basket, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Even the cottage itself was tended to. On a rare, dry day, the farmer would climb a ladder to patch a thin spot in the thatch with fresh straw, securing their shelter against the coming snows. As the early winter darkness fell by mid-afternoon, the fire's role shifted from illuminating work to fostering communion. The tools were set aside. The family drew their stools closer. This was the time for stories. The farmer's wife might tell a tale her own mother had told, of the green folk who danced in the forest on Midsummer's Eve, or of the household spirit, the hob who would help with chores if offered a bowl of cream. The farmer spoke less often, but when he did, his stories were of practical marvels. The year the apple tree bore fruit after a lightning strike. The time his grandfather found a Roman coin deep in the furrow. These were not grand epics, but threads of memory and local lore, woven together in the firelight to create a tapestry of belonging. A verbal hearth that warmed them as surely as the flames. Sometimes they played simple games with carved wooden pieces or knuckle bones, the soft clicks and occasional laughter at gentle music in the dim room. These were the arts of interiority, the crafts of the mind and spirit practiced to keep the long night at bay. Not the winter was not kind to bodies worn thin by a year's labor. Cold settled on chests, eggs made bones ache, and the damp chill could seep into joints, stiffening them with pain. This was when Agnes the healer became a frequent welcome visitor in the cottages. Her basket now held not the protective herbs of plague, but the remedies for seasonal ailments. For a racking cough, she would leave a pouch of dried coltsfoot and horehound to be steeped into a soothing syrup. For chilblains on work-roughed hands, she recommended a poultice of warmed cabbage leaves. She carried comfrey salve for aching backs and dried peppermint for settling sour winter stomachs. Her visits were quiet, practical, and infused with a calm authority that was itself a medicine. In a season of enforced stillness, when the body's weaknesses could not be ignored, her knowledge was a shield, her presence a reassurance that the community's well-being was still being tended, even in hibernation. Resilience in winter was not a dramatic defiance, but a quiet, daily persistence. It was in the careful feeding of the hearth fire, ensuring the peat and wood lasted the night. It was in the weekly inspection of the stored grain in the barn, feeling for any dampness or signs of rats. It was in the preservation of the last wrinkled apples in the loft, and the turning of the salted pork in its barrel. It was the patience of the spinner, the care of the tool mender, the endurance of sitting together in the close smoky dark, day after day. The warmth was not merely physical. It was the warmth of family, of a shared fate, of a collective holding of breath, until the world outside could be re-engaged. This was the introspective season, the time of rest and repair in its deepest sense. The frantic, outward-directed energy of plowing, sowing, weeding, and reaping was spent. Now, the energy turned inward to the maintenance of the self, the home, and the community's bonds. The farmer, by the fire, would sometimes simply stare into the flames, his face relaxed in a way it never was in the light of day. In that silence he was not a tenant or a laborer, but simply a man resting at the heart of his small world. The winter hearth was a sanctuary, a crucible where the fatigue of the past year was slowly annealed into the patience required for the next. Outside, the world was frozen, silent, waiting, but inside, in the flickering orange light, life was concentrated, resilient, and enduring. It was a deep, deliberate breath held between the exhalation of harvest and the inhalation of spring, a sacred pause in the relentless turning of the wheel. The deepest silence was not of night, but of snow. It fell for 2 days and a night without wind, a steady, patient descent that smothered the world in a thick, forgiving blanket. From his high window in the monastery scriptorium, Brother Cuthbert watched the transformation complete itself. The familiar landscape of Oakhaven, the strips, the paths, the forest's edge, was erased, replaced by a single, unbroken expanse of white, rolling like a frozen sea to the dark line of the trees. The village roofs were soft, rounded mounds. Smoke rose from them in thin grey plumes that hung motionless in the frigid air before dissolving. The world was reduced to its simplest elements: white earth, grey sky, the black scribble of bare branches. It was a page wiped clean, and in the profound quiet he felt the year draw to a close. He opened the heavy chronicle to a fresh leaf. The ink in his pot had grown thick in the cold. He warmed it briefly over the small brazier before dipping his quill. This would be the final entry for the year. His hand hesitated above the parchment. What summary could contain the wheel's full turn, he thought. Not in abstractions, but in the specific struggles he had witnessed from this very window. He saw again the bent backs behind the ploughs, in the carve. In the ploughs, in the carve, raw spring, turning the reluctant earth. He recalled the anxious clusters of villagers in the rain-lashed church, their prayers a palpable mist of fear rising with the smoke from damp wool. He remembered the frantic, silent dance of the harvesters, under the shadow no one named, and the grim, methodical division on the threshing floor. The year had been a ledger of labour, fear and loss, the loss of sun to rain, of grain to tithe and rent, of a stranger to a quicklime grave. Yet, as his gaze softened, taking in the peaceful scene below, he saw the other column in that ledger. He saw the community that had gathered to sow, 100 arms swinging in hopeful unison. He saw the faith that had compelled them to their knees on cold stone. Not as a guarantee, but as a shared act of courage in the face of helplessness. Most of all, he saw the perseverance written in the very fact of the smoke rising from those buried cottages. They had endured. The snow-covered fields were not a tomb, but a resting page. The Lord's dues were paid. The seed corn was set aside. The hearths were lit. There was a grim, hard-won integrity in that survival, a testament to a resilience that was less about triumph than about simple, dogged continuity. He bent his head and began to write, his quill scratching out a record of weather, of yield, of the quiet passing of the seasons, and the enduring rhythm of prayer and toil. The words were plain, but between them flowed the unspoken truth. The village had met the year, and the year had not broken it. In his cottage under its thick, snowy mantle, the peasant farmer was also taking stock. The great, suspended silence of the snowbound world allowed for a rare moment of stillness, a space between breaths. The relentless demands of soil and sky were finally, completely in abeyance. He pulled on his heaviest tunic and with a grunt pushed the door open against the drift that had built up against it. The cold hit him, a shocking, pure force that cleared the last vestiges of sleep from his mind. He trudged through the knee-deep snow to the small stone-built barn, his breath pluming in the still air. Inside, the air was only marginally warmer, carrying the dry, sweet smell of hay and the dusty, nutty scent of stored grain. He went to the corner where the harvest's final portion lay in sacks, stacked neatly on a raised wooden platform to keep them from damp and rats. 2. Keep them from damp and rats. He untied the neck of one sack and plunged his hand deep into the grain. The barley kernels were cool and smooth, slipping through his fingers with a soft, rustling whisper. He let them fall, listening to the sound, a music of security. He estimated the level in the sack against the marks of weeks past. It was dwindling, as it should, but at the right pace. There was enough. The calculation, rehearsed 100 times in his mind, settled into a quiet certainty. He retied